This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neatsahone, and today I'm continuing with my limited set review for Innistrad Crimson Vow. So far I've covered all the multicolored, colorless white, blue, and black cards, and today we're taking a look at red. A few caveats before we get to our first card. Keep in mind I'm only talking about limited. I'm not talking about other formats or any cards that don't appear in draft boosters. Also, these are my initial thoughts about the format before actually playing with the cards. I will put out videos with my updated thoughts on these cards over the next several weeks in a weekly vlog series I do each Saturday called Neatsa Notes. Lastly, I use a letter grade system to help sum up my thoughts on each of these cards. If you don't know what those letter grades mean, there's an explanation in the description. Alright, let's take a look at our first red card. First up, it's a Braid, which for one generic and a red is a common instant, and it says choose one. It deals 3 damage to target creature or destroy target artifact. This is a very powerful reprint, and it's one that was uncommon last time, so the downshift is pretty exciting. 2 to do 3 is always premium. You're going to trade up all the time, and having the other mode is nice too. There's not a ton of artifacts in this set, but they're around, and being able to blow those up with a card that you already have in your main deck that's really good anyway is nice upside. This is a B. Next up, it's Alchemists Gambit, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery. It has Cleave for 4 generic, 2 blue, and a red. This is a new mechanic in the set where you can pay an extra amount of mana or an alternate amount of mana, and if you do, you get to ignore some of the text on the card, the text that's in square brackets, and generally, this means the card gets more powerful. So this one says, take an extra turn after this one. During that turn, damage can't be prevented. At the beginning of that turn's instep, you lose the game. And that last sentence is what's in square brackets, and you exile Alchemist's Gambit. So without Cleave, this is unplayable. We've seen this card before, more or less, and it was unplayable. Time walks are great, but the fact you lose the game after your extra turn is terrible. It means it's only useful when exactly one more turn is what you need to win the game, and that won't come up as much as you'd think. Sure, if you will win the game by taking that extra turn, it's worth it, but you won't end up in that situation often enough to warrant running this most of the time. Now, if you do cleave it, it becomes a real time walk, one that doesn't make you lose the game, but it's an expensive one that doesn't add to the board in any way. I think you might play this in a very controlling blue-red deck, but even then, it doesn't seem incredible. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Alluring Suitor, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 vampire at uncommon, and when you attack with exactly 2 creatures, you transform it, and it becomes Deadly Dancer, a 3/3 with trample, and when this creature transforms into Deadly Dancer, you get 2 red mana, and until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end, and you can use that 2 red mana to pay for its activated ability, which gives it and another target creature +1/+0 until end of turn. So, this doesn't start with good stats, but transforming this really won't be very hard. And that means that this is frequently a 3 mana 3/3 that gives you double red the first time it transforms and has a pretty nice ability, and has trample. If you play this on turn 3 and attack with 2 things on the next turn, it will feel especially good. And it has the size and ability to stay relevant almost all game. Notably, it doesn't have to attack to transform. I mean, ideally, you probably hope you're attacking with it, but you're not always going to be able to, and it can still transform when you don't, and maybe you can use that mana for something else. There's some interesting flexibility here. Overall, though, this seems really good to me. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Ancestral Anger. It costs 1 red, it's a common sorcery, and it says target creature gains trample and gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is 1, plus the number of cards named Ancestral Anger in your graveyard, draw a card. I don't like this very much. I usually like collect them all cards, but just pumping power at sorcery speed and giving trample isn't very good. Now, I do think this has a little bit of value in the blue-red deck since it's a spell that cantrips, but I still don't think I'm impressed. I'm giving this a D. Next up, it's Ballista Watcher, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/3 human soldier werewolf at uncommon. It has an ability where you can pay 2 generic and a red and tap it, and it deals 1 damage to any target, and it has Daybound. It's back in this set. Once you play a card with Daybound, day and night start to be tracked, and day becomes night if a player casts no spell during their own turn, and it becomes night that next turn. And once it is night, or if it's already night when you play this, it comes down as Ballista Wielder, a 5/5 werewolf at uncommon, and you can pay 2 generic and a red, and it deals 1 damage to any target, and a creature dealt damage this way can't block this turn. And it has Nightbound. Night can turn back into day if any player casts 2 spells on their turn. The night will change to day on that next turn. So Pinging stuff with this is a little costly, but it's a nice ability, capable of picking off small creatures and making combat more complicated for your opponent, and it comes on a 4-mana 4/3, which is fine. And when it's nighttime, it becomes a 5/5 with a way better version of its first ability. First, the creature doesn't have to tap, so you can sink more mana into it, and it also makes the creature it hits unable to block, which is a big deal. It's an ability that can just end games. This looks really good to me, I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Belligerent Guest, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 vampire at common. It's got trample, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you make a blood token. We're going to see a lot of blood in this video. These are artifacts that you can pay 1 mana and tap and discard a card to sacrifice, and then you draw a card. This is a decent common. It has alright stats, and it's going to make you blood sometimes. I mean, if your opponent's in a situation where they can't block it and they just have to take the full hit, you know you're probably getting at least 2 blood out of it because of trample, and that's going to feel pretty good because there's some pretty real blood payoffs around. So, you don't love this card. It has not the greatest stats ever, but its ability to make blood tokens really will potentially help you get some serious value. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Blood Hypnosis, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/3 uncommon vampire. It can't block, and whenever you sacrifice 1 or more blood tokens, target creature can't block this turn. This ability triggers only once each turn. This looks really good to me. Sure, it can't block, but the fact that it can make opposing things unable to block too is nice, especially because you're going to be sacrificing blood. This can really be a pretty devastating part of your curve out. Obviously, you need the blood, but again, if you're in red, you're just going to have it. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Blood Petal Celebrant, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 vampire at common. It has first strike as long as it's attacking, and when it dies, you make a blood token. This is a nice common. We've seen 2-mana 2/1s who have first strike when they attack before, and they're always pretty good 2-drop aggro creatures, and this one gives you some blood when it goes down. I don't imagine you'll ever cut this in red decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Bloody Betrayal, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It says gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature, gains haste until end of turn, create a blood token. It takes a special format for threat and effects to be good, and I don't think this is one of them. You either need a legitimate sacrifice deck in red, or an incredibly aggressive format for it to work out, since it's the kind of effect that doesn't give you anything permanently, the blood token notwithstanding. So when you cast it, and you're going down a card, you better kill your opponent or get them close to it. You could maybe combine it with Exploit if you're in red or blue, and that could be spicy, but you'll need a significant amount of mana to make this happen most of the time. The blood token doesn't really help it overcome these shortcomings. I think it's a D+, like most threatens. Next up, it's Cemetery Gatekeeper, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 vampire at Mythic Rare. It has first strike, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile a card from a graveyard. Whenever a player plays a land or casts a spell, if it shares a card type with the exiled card, the Gatekeeper deals 2 damage to that player. A 2-mana 2/1 with first strike always makes the cut. So the Graveyard Hate upside combined with the ability to do additional damage is pretty nice. The effect here is symmetrical, unlike the other cards in this cycle, so you'll potentially hurt yourself too, but if you're the beatdown, your opponent losing the life will be the much bigger cost. I think this is probably the weakest of this cycle in Limited, but it's still pretty good. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it is Chandra Dressed to Kill, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a legendary planeswalker Chandra at Mythic Rare. She starts with 3 loyalty. She has a +1 that adds red to your mana pool, and she deals 1 damage to up to 1 target player or planeswalker. She has another +1 that says exile the top card of your library. If it's red, you may cast it this turn. And she has a -7 that says exile the top 5 cards of your library. You may cast red spells from among them this turn. You get an emblem with whenever you cast a red spell. This emblem deals X damage to any target, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. This is not a great planeswalker for Limited. She's not bad. She's just also not a bomb or even close to it. She's cheap, and getting her down early will often feel pretty good, but her 2+1s are pretty underwhelming in Limited. Sure, the ramp can help you a bit, and damaging your opponent is never bad, but you'll find yourself unable to really take advantage of that extra mana more often than you'd think. Then her other +1 is going to whiff way too often in Limited. You're almost always at least 2 colors in Limited, and then you have to take into account lands. And that means her +1 will just exile a card off the top of your library for no value more often than it won't. And that's way too much. Now, if you do manage to go mono red, she gets a pretty big upgrade, but that's usually not the right thing to do unless the color's insanely open. Her ultimate has the same problem. It zeroes in on red spells specifically, so yeah, she definitely has constructed potential where you can jam her into a mono red aggro or burn deck, but that just isn't something that comes together in Limited. I think she's probably just a C. You're going to get the most mileage out of her first +1, which will ramp you a bit and damage your opponent some, and the other abilities almost aren't there. Next up, it's Change of Fortune, which for 3 generic and a red is a rare sorcery. It says discard your hand, then draw a card for each card you've discarded this turn. So the idea here is to use a bunch of blood tokens and other discard effects and then cast this, I guess. If you can do that, it will certainly feel pretty good, since the cards you discard as a result of Change of Fortune will also draw you cards. So say you have 3 cards in your hand and 5 mana, you can sacrifice 2 blood tokens, then cast this and draw 5 cards. That's not too bad, but I don't feel like it's great either. You're not normally going to be netting very many cards without significant setup, and in fact, you'll be going down a card a lot of the time. It's basically just the world's biggest rummage effect most of the time. Seems a little too tricky to make it work in limited. I'm just going to give it a D. Next up, it's Creepy Puppeteer, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 rare human rogue with haste, and when it attacks, if you attack with exactly one other creature this combat, you may have that creature's base power and toughness become 4/3 until end of turn. So a 4-mana 4/3 with haste would be making the cut pretty much all the time already, and the fact this can make a friend into a 4/3 as well is really nice. If you're buffing a token or something that's going to add a ton of power to the board out of nowhere, that's going to feel pretty good. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Curse of Hospitality, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare or a curse with enchant player. Creatures attacking enchanted player have trample. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to enchanted player, that player exiles the top card of their library. Until end of turn, that creature's controller may play this card, and they may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. This is really interesting. It effectively grants your whole board trample, and makes it so you get some serious card advantage anytime you hit your opponent, which of course is more likely because of the trample thing. You do need some board state to really get this thing going most of the time, but the card advantage this thing will grant you in the long run, or even in one turn sometimes, is a huge deal, and it's nice that it gives at least some bonus immediately in the form of trample. I think this looks pretty good. I do think you need to have enough of a real board state, and your opponent needs to be defenseless enough for it to really work effectively, that it's not a bomb, but I do think it's a B. It will really alter games and give you some serious advantages if you just have a better board state than your opponents. Next up, it's Daybreak Combatants, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 human warrior at common. It's got haste, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This adds a significant amount of power to the board out of nowhere, something we've been saying in this video already. There's lots of haste in red. The boost is going to be enough to enable some attacks you may just not have had before, and the fact that it can get in there too is pretty nice. In a pinch, you can also just make it into a 4/2 with haste, and that's not too shabby for 3 mana. I think this is a C+. I can see this being a really important common for red aggro decks. Next up, it's Dominating Vampire, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a 3/3 vampire at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you gain control of target creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of vampires you control until end of turn. Untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. Worst case, you get a 3 mana 3/3 that can threaten a 1 mana value creature. That's not great, it usually won't have a target, but as a fail case, that's not too bad. Once you have other vampires in play, it will start to feel pretty great, as stealing a real creature and sending it back at your opponent while you also add to the board is pretty significant. But, you know, it's not always going to actually do something. It really depends on what the board state looks like to a significant degree. But this has a reasonable floor and a pretty nice ceiling. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's In the Festivities, which for 1 red mana is a common sorcery, and it deals 1 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. Yeah, no thanks. This is a sideboard card. There aren't enough X1s in this format that you want to be doing this. It's an F in your main deck and like a C- at best out of your sideboard. You just won't find yourself being able to do something with this often enough. Next up, it's Falcon Wrath Celebrants, which for 4 generic and a red is a 4/4 vampire with menace at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you get 2 blood tokens. This is a decent 5-drop. A 5 mana 4/4 with menace is not great. It's probably a C- at best, but the 2 blood tokens it give you can fuel some stuff or improve your hand. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Fearful Villager, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 human werewolf at common with menace, as daybound, of course, and its nightbound side is Fearsome Werewolf, and it's a 4/3 with menace. A 3 mana 2/3 with menace is reasonable, and this will be bigger sometimes. It's not anything exciting, but if you need a 3-drop that's aggressive, it does an okay job. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Flame Blessed Bolt, which for 1 red mana is a common instant. It deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. This is premium removal. 1 mana for 2 at instant speed always is, as you can very easily trade up. The exile clause definitely matters because of the disturb mechanic too. This is a B-. Next up, it's Frenzied Devils, which for 4 generic and a red is a 3/3 devil at uncommon. It's got haste, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. This card's a bit awkward. It costs 5, so most of the time you're not going to be able to buff it the first turn you play it, so having haste, while certainly better than not having haste, won't be that great. And it starts out so small that it dies to a ton of stuff, and that's not something I love on a 5-mana creature. Now, the upside here is that this thing is incredibly hard to block if you have cards in hand and mana available, and your opponent will find themselves just taking it when that's the case, or chump blocking it because they might die to lethal, and playing that threat of activation game can be pretty nice. It combines really well with cheap cantrips and stuff like that, but the baseline here is just not very exciting. Giving this a C. Next up, it's Honeymoon Hearst, which for 2 generic and a red is a 5/5 artifact vehicle at uncommon. It's got trample, and you tap 2 untapped creatures you control, and it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. This vehicle doesn't need to be crewed exactly, though tapping down 2 creatures isn't that far from crewing. For 3 mana, it brings some pretty nice stats and an evasive keyword ability, and it will definitely be nice to tap a couple of small creatures who couldn't attack anyway to put this thing into action. You won't always have those creatures though, and sometimes you'll just have some larger creatures where attacking with them makes more sense. I think this is just a C. Next, it's Hungry Ridge Wolf, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 wolf at common, and as long as you control another wolf or werewolf, it gets +1/+0 and gains trample. This isn't the most exciting payoff ever, but it has a decent baseline, and sometimes it'll be a 3/2 with trample, which is pretty nice. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Ill-Tempered Loner, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 3/3 human werewolf at rare. When it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target. You can pay 1 generic and a red, and it gets +2/+0 until end of turn, and it has Daybound. Its Nightbound side is Howlpack Avenger, and it says whenever a permanent you control is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target, and it still can pump its power +2/+0 for 1 generic and a red. This is really good. The front side is hard to interact with and not get 2 for 1. Removal that doesn't do damage is the only way to do it. And yeah, that's around, but that really narrows the number of things that can effectively deal with Ill-Tempered Loner. It's great it can pump its power too, increasing the chances of getting that 2 for 1. It will be tough for your opponent to block it, but the threat of activation will sometimes force people to do it, and when that happens, they're probably getting blown out, and I like those options. Obviously, once it transforms, it gets way scarier, and if it is already night when you play it, it will immediately impact the board in a massive way. Your whole board will suddenly just be able to attack, and your opponent's blocks that do damage will all just wreck them. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Into the Night, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It says it becomes night. Discard any number of cards and draw that many cards +1. This doesn't look very good. Sure, your werewolves will get more impressive, but we saw in the last format that doing that isn't that great, and 4 mana for that effect definitely is not worth it. I know it's accompanied by a rummage effect, but having enough cards in your hand to make that really worth it doesn't seem very likely to me. It does replace itself effectively, but a 4 mana sorcery that does this is ugly. I'm giving this a D. Next up, it's Kessick Flame Breather, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 human shaman at common, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. Every time we see a non-creature spell payoff that pings the opponent, it's ended up being pretty solid. It will tend to do enough incidental damage throughout the game that it ends up being a pretty nice payoff. This is a solid common. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Kessick Wolf Rider, which for 1 red is a 1/2 human knight at rare. It's got Menace. And you can pay 2 generic and a red and tap it to exile 3 cards from your graveyard, and you get a 3/2 red wolf creature token. This wolf version of Grim Lavamancer looks pretty good. A 1 mana 1/2 with Menace can chip in for some unblockable damage early, and then in the late game this gives you a pretty great thing to spend mana on, as 3/2 wolves can quickly overwhelm most board states. While red doesn't have a ton of self-mill going on, there's enough rummaging with blood that I think getting this set up to give you that 3/2 in the mid to the late game isn't too crazy, though you probably shouldn't really expect to generate more than 2 or 3, even in ideal situations, but 2 or 3 is plenty. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Lacerate Flesh, which for 4 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It deals 4 damage to target creature, and you create a number of blood tokens equal to the amount of excess damage dealt to that creature this way. This is some mediocre removal. 5 for 4 damage isn't good, and you'll often have to trade down. Getting some blood doesn't really save it from mediocrity. It is still removal, and brings some blood and spell synergy, so it's something you'll play sometimes, but I think it's just a C. Next up, it's Lamholt Raconteur, which for 3 generic and a red is a 2/4 human werewolf at uncommon, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and it's got Daybound. The other side is Lamholt Ravager, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it does 2 damage to each opponent, and it's a 4/4. So it's pretty interesting. They put this same payoff on 2 different cards. If you can get multiples of these things, you're going to be doing a lot of damage to your opponent, and like the other one, this is a nice spell payoff for the deck, and it has way more upside than the 2-mana 1/3 does. So I like this a fair bit, especially in blue-red, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Lightning Wolf, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 wolf at common, and you can pay 1 generic and a red to give it first strike until end of turn, but you can only activate it as a sorcery. A card that's just a 4-mana 4/3 is like a D+ these days, so giving this first strike is definitely an upgrade, but the fact that you can only do it at sorcery speed is a real bummer. Sure, it'll be harder for your opponent to block, but don't love this. It's probably just a C-. Next up, it's Magma Pummeler, which for X and 2 red is a 0/0 elemental at uncommon. It enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, and if damage would be dealt to Magma Pummeler, while it has a +1/+1 counter on it, you prevent that damage and remove that many +1/+1 counters from it. When 1 or more counters are removed from Magma Pummeler this way, it deals that much damage to any target. This is a neat design. It'll never be an efficient creature, due to how it's costed, but even if you just put this on the table as a 4-mana 2/2, your opponent will find themselves in a situation where attacking is very difficult because of the 2-for-1 potential. It just scales up from there, and in the late game will be a huge problem since it can also damage players. Now, it can still straight up die to lots of removal, but damage-based removal will pretty much be off the table, and that helps. I can really see situations where this will be incredible, but it would be silly to not also think about the times where it just doesn't matter because it's not big enough, or your opponent has too much life, or you just really need to add something more meaningful to the board, but I think the ceiling is high enough here that I want to give it a B-. Next up, it's Manaform Hellkite, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you make an XX red dragon illusion creature token with flying and haste, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. Exile that token at the beginning of the next in-step. Obviously, this is great. A 4-mana 4/4 with flying is an excellent limited card, and this one comes with the ability to churn out other dragons. They don't stick around forever, and your deck needs a decent number of non-creature spells to really make use of it, but that's fine. Just attacking once with a free token is going to make this feel great, and sometimes you're just going to go off with this. It's a pity Flashback isn't back in this set because this would be even crazier, but as it stands, it's still a pretty impressive bomb, and I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Markov Retribution, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It says choose one or both. Creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn, or target vampire you control deals damage equal to its power to another target creature. This is a nice vampire payoff. Keep in mind the effect is not a fight effect. The creature just does damage equal to its power to a creature. And the card will also give +1/+0 to the vampire, so its chances of taking things down do go up considerably. If you're in red, you're likely to end up with some vampires without even trying, so I don't think this needs a straight-up build-around grade, though obviously it's at its best in black-red, where you have a real critical mass of vampires, but there's a decent number of vampires in like red-white too. Overall, I think this looks like it has a pretty incredible ceiling, as punching a blocker out of the way and attacking with a board that is buffed is very nice. Like always with this kind of thing, you have to pick your spot carefully, since if they destroy your creature that you're punching with, you won't be getting anything out of this card, really. You will still get the board boost, I guess, but that's not going to be enough. Still, I think you can spend a pretty high pick on this. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Olivia's Attendants, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 6/6 vampire at rare with menace. When it deals damage, you create that many blood tokens, and you can pay 2 generic and a red, and it deals 1 damage to any target. This is very impressive. A 6-mana 6/6 with menace is something that would make the cut at the top of your curve pretty frequently, and these Attendants bring so much more value. They will crank out blood tokens in a hurry, and then the thing that really pushes it into bomb range is the ability to just ping things, which, by the way, will also give you blood tokens. So, yeah, this has efficient stats and powerful abilities. You do need it to survive until your next turn in most cases to get it going, but it's definitely a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Pyre Spawn, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 6/4 elemental at common, and when it dies, it deals 3 damage to any target. This does not have good stats, but the fact it bolts a thing when it dies does usually mean you can get a 2-for-1 out of it, and if your opponent's life is low, they're going to be sweating this a ton. I think this is a decent top curve card. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Reckless Impulse, which for 1 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It says exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. I like that we're seeing more of these so-called impulsive draw effects. Seeing one at common is pretty neat. Anyway, this can sometimes feel like 2 mana to draw 2, which is quite good. Other times you might hit 2 lands and that won't feel great, but I think most of the time getting 2 cards of value out of this will happen, especially if you don't play a land before you play it, and you pretty much never should. This looks like a solid spell for red decks, especially in blue-red. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Rending Flame, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon instant that deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that permanent is a spirit, it deals 2 damage to that permanent's controller. This is premium removal and then some. 3 to do 5 at instant speed is excellent, and it will do 2 extra damage to your opponent on occasion, which is pretty nice. This is one of the better uncommons in the set, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Runebound Wolf, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 wolf at uncommon. You can pay 3 generic and a red and tap it, and it deals damage equal to the number of wolves and werewolves you control to target opponent. This is nice. It's a bear with very nice upside. Even on its own, its ability does 1 damage to your opponent, and while that isn't remotely efficient, it is nice that it does a thing even if it's all alone. And as long as you're doing 2 or more with this, the damage will become a huge factor in the later part of the game. And sometimes it's just going to be doing serious chunks of damage. This looks to me like it has a very real upside and a pretty reasonable floor. You almost always play this in red decks, and in some of them, it's going to be one of your best cards. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Sanguine Statuette, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon artifact, and when it enters the battlefield, you make a blood token. Whenever you sacrifice a blood token, you can have it become a 3/3 vampire artifact creature with haste until end of turn. On its own, you'll be able to activate this once, and while that's not amazing, it is nice that it can do a thing without any other help, unlike some payoffs. Plus, you can play this and sack the token for an additional mana and rumble right away with it, which will come up sometimes. You do probably need a critical mass of blood to get it going, but I think most red decks will have like 5 ways to make treasure without trying super hard. Obviously, you can end up with way more in black-red, but just 5 is probably okay. I think this is a C. Seems like a decent payoff. Next up, it's Stenzia Uprising, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a rare enchantment. It says at the beginning of your end step, create a 1/1 red human creature token. Then, if you control exactly 13 permanents, you may sacrifice Stenzia Uprising, and when you do, it deals 7 damage to any target. 4 mana to get a 1/1 token every turn isn't exactly good. The additional upside here is pretty nice, of course, as getting a couple of tokens and doing 7 for 4 mana is a great deal. It is reasonably likely that you'll eventually get to 13 permanents with this in play, provided the game goes long enough. After all, it provides 2 permanents almost immediately. This will create an interesting minigame sometimes, like if you have 2 mini permanents, your opponent will find themselves in an awkward position when you attack them or when they attack you, and if you have too few, your opponent may go out of their way to keep it from triggering. Now, they probably shouldn't go that hard unless 7 is enough to kill them on the spot, but even just removing a creature with this seems pretty good. This is a weird card, but my initial impression is that it's pretty good. It actually adds to the board right away. At the end of your first turn, you get that token, and that's not a big thing to add to the board, but it's not like it's doing nothing up until the point when it does 7 damage. I think the whole package here is a B. Next up, it's Sure Strike, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant, and it says target creature gets +3/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. We see this trick a lot. It can make almost any creature win combat, which is nice, but it doesn't have the additional value of raising your creature's toughness, which can help save it from removal and stuff like that. But the main purpose of tricks is to use them in combat anyway. You'll play this in aggro decks for sure. I'm giving this a C-. Doing 2 to the whole board can be pretty nice, and obviously if you're a deck with lots of vampires, you can make this kind of one-sided. Of course, the downside is that your opponent might have vampires too, in which case this won't feel too good, but I still think you're basically always playing the first copy of this in a black-red deck in the format. It'll be able to kill enough things, and the fail case of making blood isn't too bad. I don't think it's anything special though. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Volatile Arsonist, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 human werewolf. At Mythic Rare, it has Menace and Haste, and when it attacks, it deals 1 damage to each of up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target player, and up to 1 target planeswalker. It's also got Daybound, and its Nightbound side is Dire Strain Anarchist. It also has Menace and Haste. It's a 5/5, and when it attacks, it deals 2 damage to each of up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target player, and or up to 1 target planeswalker. A 5-mana 4/4 with Menace and Haste is something you would end up playing most of the time, and this obviously has way more going on. Its attack trigger will typically let you do 2 damage to an opposing creature and an opponent, and you'll be getting the first trigger right away most of the time thanks to haste. The 1 damage you do can also increase the chances that your opponent can't effectively block this thing without getting 2 for 1. And if it gets to attack more than once or transforms, it becomes way better. I don't think it's quite a bomb. The ability is nice, but not game-breaking most of the time, but it is a very good card. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Valderian Epicure, which for 1 red is a 1/1 vampire at common, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you create a blood token. This does a bunch of little things, and I think they add up to make this a decent card. I don't think you'll always play it, but chances are good if you're interested in the blood, which will be especially true in black-red, getting this on turn 1 can power a lot of those cards. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Voltaic Visionary, which for 1 generic and a red is a 3/1 human wizard at uncommon. You can tap it and it deals 2 damage to you. You exile the top card of your library and you can play that card this turn, activate only as a sorcery, and whenever you play a card exiled with it, you transform Voltaic Visionary and it becomes Volt Charged Berserker, a 4/3 human berserker that can't block. This is a neat design. Ideally, it will be a 2-mana 4/3 that can't block that draws you a card for 2 life, and that's something you'd always play. The problem is sometimes it'll exile a card you can't play, but if your curve is low enough or it's late, it shouldn't be too hard for this to net you that card and transform this. The downside is that, yeah, once it transforms, it can't block, and trading won't be super easy, so it's mostly just sort of a mindless attacker once it reaches that point, but I think the initial value you can get out of this card is well worth the life. I'm giving it a C+. And we're finishing up with our last red card, which is Wary Prisoner, which for 3 generic and a red is a 2/6 human werewolf at common with Defender. Of course, it has Daybound, and its Nightbound side is a 6/6 that attacks each combat if able. This reminds me a lot of Tavern Brawler, a card that ended up being super underwhelming in Midnight Hunt. On one side, it's a defensive creature, and on the other, it's an aggressively costed big creature. Those two things are a bit awkward together, and if you played Midnight Hunt, you know that completely controlling day and night how you want isn't always easy. This might end up being better than the Brawler. Midnight Hunt did have an unusual amount of good common removal that made big vanilla creatures that don't leave some value behind particularly bad, but right now I kind of feel like that's true of this set too, and I'm pretty skeptical, giving this a C-. Well, those are my initial thoughts for all the red cards in Crimson Vow. I'll be back tomorrow with a look at all the green cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of the set review coming out over the next several days, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on some of my other videos, including more of this set review, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you're enjoying my content, if you're enjoying this set review and you want to go the extra mile in supporting me, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.